Hello everyone, today we talk about the Visconti and Veneto signories, army organization and warfare in the second half of the 14th century. In the past years I already made multiple videos about the era of the soldiers of fortune, of mercenary companies in Italy. We didn't actually descend much in the details, made something about the later condottieri in the 15th century. But the 14th century is a very overlooked time in European history and warfare, and not just because I specialize exactly in this century, and also because it's objectively pretty messed up, right? The 14th century for every medievalist is either love or hate, right? It's a terrible puzzle that you have to put together. It's a moment of crisis, fundamentally, but also a moment of further definition and consolidation, and that has escaped, in fact, historiography mostly in that direction. Right, historiography has been somewhat emotionalistic over the centuries about the moments of crisis that are often actually some of the brightest, right, in terms of civilizational output. And in those videos about, in fact, 14th century Italian warfare to court, right? We have made other videos about that, but we ended up mostly focusing on this phase, the affirmation. I made a video last spring, for example, about the decline of the communal army and the rise of the condottieri. It was across the century, also talking about the 15th, and also other videos about the Italian communal army. But we never descended in the details and in the specifics, not even, if not maybe just for Venice, in the specifics of army organization and tactics yet. Today I want to focus specifically on the Visconti Lordship that last autumn or winter I made a video on. At least I made a history of Milan from 1300 to 1450. So we are already at the end of the period with Sforza coming to power, but fundamentally the Milanese state was created and consolidated, properly founded beyond the commune of Milan itself by the Visconti Lordship. And about them also, I say this, not just to make a bit of, advertisement, but properly because I realize, yes, first of all, that many people don't know how many videos I've actually made and how vital for this channel the playlists are, but properly because there is a background that one should have, generally speaking, about the period, the protagonists. In this case, we'll look at Milan, but we had not made really much about the northeastern signories in Italy yet. I made just recently a video about medieval Friuli, for example, but as far as the La Scala, for example, or the da Carrara signories are involved, specifically the Veneto ones, we didn't make much, though. Today we focus on Milan, actually. It was, of course, the actually largest power in communal Italy, and in fact, the most military developed, right? Also the most politically organized and sound, and the one that, in fact, at the eve of the Italian wars was the closest to a state in a modern sense, right? And that in the 14th century had to deal, in fact, from the top of this position that had already reached since the end of the 13th, with the soldiers of fortune, with the military companies, of which the Visconti were, as we will see now, some of the best, if not properly the best employers, also the best payers, and that had, through such companies, given the Milanese position in the center of the Po Valley, kind of controlling some of the most urbanized areas in the peninsula, a very specific political and strategic function also towards the other the neighbors in general, because most of the mercenaries that came, especially in the first half of the 14th century, were Germans, and the Visconti, as you know, were Ghibellines at this point. Milan had been fiercely wealth, as you know, in the struggle of the Lombard League against Frederick Barbarossa, also later on with his grandson Frederick II. But the Visconti eventually had brought Milan in the Ghibelline sphere. This had developed as an autonomous polity, in fact, of the Holy Roman Empire, receiving substantial support from the Germans, and also as a consequence, lot of Transalpine mercenaries that made the bulk of the same Milanese forces. So Milan had a role in kind of regularizing earlier than any other Italian polity the employment of the German mercenaries that were quite effective but also quite unruly, and thus required a very strong authority to be kept under, which succeeded, interestingly enough. There are comparisons that can be drawn, for example, between Italy and Scandinavia regarding the employment of German mercenaries at this point. As we have seen already in those videos about the rise of the mercenary companies, the condotta, and the condottieri, in fact, we say that this the opportunity to resize the traditional imagery of an Italy victim, say passive victim of the bullying and abuses of the soldiers of fortune. The opportunity to resize the traditional image of an Italy passive victim of the bullying and abuses of the soldiers of fortune is evident, right? There's been this phase in the same Italian historiography, due mostly to national reasons, right? The Risorgimento in the 19th century, as most countries in Europe brought on the fore this kind of nationalistic idea that whichever foreign interference was somewhat a tragedy of sort. And of course, you cannot think this in a time like the Middle Ages, where there is a universal empire, and thus the same Italians for some time considered the employment of mercenary companies, and the fact that some of these essentially escaped control of the Italian lords, but it was the Italian lords that effectively discharged them without giving a damn about where they would have kept roaming around, has in fact prevailed as a sort of kind of national tragedy. If you actually study the political and military history of these events, you'll realize that these mercenary companies, as much as they could pillage during their passage around the Italian communes, their fortified cities, and the relation that they had with them, fundamentally didn't make any significant gain. Right? As we were saying before, in Scandinavia, you have the Scandinavian kingdoms literally taken over by German mercenaries. Right? In Italy, you don't find anything of this kind. You find, at best, mercenaries that were at the service of certain lords and that were, at a point, blackmailing them by saying, if you don't pay me more, I will pass just to the other side, or I will not render your service. There were instances of coups, right, that, however, could not be sustained by the mercenaries per se, because the cities fundamentally were not could not really be taken over. There are very few instances in which this was possible with secondary cities, for example, like Lucca, right? Think about the Cerullo company of mercenaries, German mercenaries that at a point kidnapped even the scion of the Visconti that had come to them to negotiate it, but he would actually become his leader, right? And Lucca was just essentially a city there that was being that had brutally decayed because of the enormous military effort he had carried out against Florence under the Castracani, and Florence, Milan, and also other powers were, such as Pisa, for example, were contending it, right? And the German mercenaries thought to be in the middle, right, to actually sell the city to the highest bidder, let's say, and the thing though, like you don't find like I don't know, Milan taken over by these mercenaries, Florence taken over by these mercenaries, even Bologna or Genoa or wherever. This thing did not happen, right? And what it mostly happened instead was that the Italian city-states would form leagues that would throw these mercenaries against one another, right? And literally paying them and sustaining their armies. That is to say, without the money that the Italian communes provided to these to these armies, that these armies could have not existed. This is evident for the same Rome fart of Henry of Luxembourg, even more of Ludwig of Bavaria, if we're not talking about Charles of Luxembourg, John and Charles of Luxembourg, and Charles also later on. These powers were exceedingly wealthy, and they would simply say, look, we need some feudal leader of sort, connected also with the German. Very often is searching for imperial protection. But not only, because at different times also the Habsburgs that were not emperors at a point where they would intervene. That was also France intervening. All these powers were kind of intervening against one another within the same Italy. There was Hungary, there was Naples, there was the same major communal powers, as a matter of fact. So the picture of, one day, certain areas of Europe like woke up, these mercenaries arrived for no reason and began to pillage and loot and then went away, is actually not real, right? These men were called specifically to serve in some of the most advanced militaries, in fact, of the time. And when they, the lords didn't want to pay them anymore, they simply stopped doing it and expelled them and began to roam the peninsula until they basically had to come back to Germany, wherever they came from. There were many different nationalities, telling the truth, mostly French, Burgundians, and more. There were Occitanians, Flemish, Hungarians, yes, and other Central Europeans. But the picture is complicated by the fact that there is no unitary history in all this, meaning that if you want to study exactly what happened, you should know in detail the history of all the, practically at this point, not, say, 30 independent communes anymore, because fundamentally the signories by the mid-14th century have already taken over much larger territories than just one single communal district. So we're talking about less powers, but in practice, even in here, you don't yet have something like a compact state, right? The same Milan that we'll see today that ruled over essentially the whole of Lombardy, Emilia, and part of the current regions of Piedmont, Romagna, and Tuscany, was essentially lording in a feudal sense, right? There was a free commune within the Holy Roman Empire, sometimes also in other areas such as the Papal States or the Venetians will expand on the mainland just later. But say these were traditionally autonomous polities, and that they recognized, in this case, the Visconti signory, which meant that they had to pay a little bit and provide even some, mostly paying, or sometimes also military support, direct one, to Milan. And so there were mostly these, in fact, coalition armies that by this point had turned mostly into mercenary armies, paid by the single lord of the greatest, most powerful city, in this case Milan. That was indeed, after, we were talking about Florence, Venice, and Milan, essentially, as the greatest city powers, and in fact would swallow all the others in the process, aside from, of course, the Papal States, who were a bit something more feudal in nature, but it did have communes in the same way. And Naples, it was a truly feudal state where the communes did exist, but were not like in the center, in the north of the peninsula. There was Genoa, other also feudal realities. Think about the Este, for example, or other lineages of the Holy Roman Empire. And all this again was framed in the broader European game, which constantly interfered with Italy. Now that I remember, yes, I made a video specifically about the foreign intervention in Italy during the 14th century, which tells you exactly what we're talking about, and highlights exactly that point of the dependency very often of also those Transalpine powers on the support that the financial support that the single signories at this point could provide them. Right, the Visconti paid for their ducal title, for example, paying a lot of money to the emperor because they could afford that, and that was recognized. So that's the kind of praxis that we're discussing, and hopefully, naturally, today we will just see some aspects, mostly of the military development and some broader, yes, political and strategical dynamics, but there are very specific details here that I hope at some point to have the time to go in depth in. So as we were saying before, there's hardly even a phase where the mercenary companies had been able to dominate, right, certain areas. Generally speaking, this is true, as we were saying before, for Lucca, for example. That, again, was just an autonomous city that was just at a distance, maintained temporarily by a mercenary company that was not affiliated to any other institution. This is the other important aspect with these companies, that for a longer time, these are private contractors that do not really have a territorial routing. Differently from other times in history, you don't have, for example, a settlement of these forces. You don't have an integration. You realize that also much of the violence that flared at the time was surely fueled by the Italians, first of all, because, again, it was them who paid for all the thing, and that had actually very good reasons for fighting against each other successfully, and especially for these powers that really paid the mercenaries the most. But that as a consequence, these veterans were very often and literally alienated from the local communities that didn't like them at all, who shut their gates, who didn't want to have anything to do with them, and whenever they were obliged to get them in, what very often also rose in arms, challenging the same. This we're considering this fact is that the mercenaries here are mostly knights, right? In the refeudalization of European military culture by the mid 14th century, to the face of all those morons that think that there was a linear progress of infantry towards the late Middle Ages, you have in the city streets definitely the infantry, and in open field really not. Actually, there is a sharp decline and contraction, also due to the Black Death, the demographic and economic shock that followed and so on. But within the city gates, all these bourgeois that had also abandoned the military participation, not because they were necessarily just without any force, but because they didn't just want to go out there fighting when they had enough money to pay others to fight in their stead, would be quite, annoyed by very often the abuses, again, of these foreigners that were these were soldiers. So these are people that we know very well also from the documents, from the trials, from many witnesses, that simply, just like the Italian soldiers, there is no difference in this regard, but in the professional identity of the same, the fact that they didn't understand, there was not a difference between peace and wartime. These people used violence as the normal, daily interaction in a way. Of course, I'm exceeding. It's not that they weren't incapable of civil behavior. Their constables were quite smart in this regard, and they understood the local political game very well for them to exploit, let's say. But the soldiery was, of course, some of the most viciously violent and properly mentally alienated troop that you can imagine. Of course, they were tempted by being the arm, fundamental, of some authorities, but that relied, however, on them to the point of thinking that if they wanted, they could also abuse the local population. So this would happen all the time as well. It was also a mean for the lords to assert greater power on the populations. This is a moment also great fortification of the urban environment, probably with citadels, with castles within the same city gates and so on, that were aimed at properly securing control of the population, avoiding rebelling. Because again, let's say a Milanese ruling over Bologna was perceived as a foreigner, right? A forestiere, literally in Italian. Of course, more, say, a closer one culturally, and then they understood each other by speaking, which is a big deal compared to a German or to a Provençal and so on. But still, a foreign occupation, de facto, right? And historiography up to this point has stressed, especially the because they don't study military history much, so they stress just mostly the institutional, juridical side of the story, showing, oh, look, but the commune remains. Well, thanks to my eyes, it remains. It was the normal institution. It was the cities ruled and all these things. But just look at what actually happens politically and socially, and realize that any coup, any establishment, any regime change occurred, passed through a military encounter, to a battle, where mostly the single communes were knocked out one by one, especially the minor ones that were also a bit more traditionalist, generally speaking, because they didn't have enough money to pay for the best mercenaries, even if these were present pretty much everywhere. But I mean, having such a powerfully structured army like the Milanese one, it was also relatively simple, right? Again, the bulk was made up of these knights, right? The famous barbutes, they were called, that were the helmet, gave the name to the unit, right? Not even just to the single guys, just like the lanks later. This is mostly the age of the barbute, organically speaking, and that provided with this dramatic shock in open field. There were infantry, the great, for example, infantry wings of tens of thousands of pikemen, crossbowmen, and pavismen that had somewhat contracted, right? They had not disappeared. Also, the traditional exercitus of essentially Romano-Germanic origin was there, but it was ever less summoned, because that was the citizens, the peasants, and those people were ever more detached, properly, from the use of arms, both because they objectively didn't want to go at war, and because the lords were disarming the populations. And when you look actually at the mercenary companies, they were a pretty effective military mean. I mean, considering the general degree of political and social control existing in Europe, well, this military instrument was pretty effective. As a matter of fact, the Italians had some of the largest armies in Europe. The Milanese, the Della Scala, that today we'll not discuss so much, but the sources say it openly that they could have 5,000 to 6,000 of these knights in their service and using them regularly. Right? Consider, do you realize what that means? That just France. In fact, Villani says that openly that these forces were second, or actually equal, if you look at the numbers, only to the Kingdom of France. But hardly anyone today know about the Della Scala, for example. Well, that's a bit the Italian exception in how they knew how to cope with the system. Like, let's say the weaker point of Italy was the central part, the central section. So we're talking mostly about Tuscany and the Papal States. The reason being that the political landscape was more fragmented. You know that Florence took ages before, say, subjugating in a sort of confederacy the rest of the Tuscan communes. The Papal State were also, as we were saying before, kind of a feudal reality where you have Rome, but also the surrounding areas are not so strongly urbanized like Tuscany or Lombardy. And then you have the Apennine, Interland, and the Romagnol areas that are full of feudal lineages. They're actually very good warriors. This is scarcely known, but also the Papal States, had they been politically united in a more statal fashion, consider that at this point the papacy is at Avignon, and even when it comes back, they have to recover all that grip on these communities. They had easily the largest military potential in the entire peninsula. In fact, later on, also in the 15th century, the best condottieri were from Rome, essentially, from the Roman nobility, from the Apennine nobility of central Italy. And think about the Montefeltro as well. These were from the other side of the Apennine, actually. But they were families who were properly into the military business since ever, right? Properly, they had a specific curriculum, specific stages. They started at a young age, commanding 20 men, 40 men, 100 men. They rose, right? And they came to command, in fact, tens of thousands of men in service, and that's also how they became condottieri in that regard, of larger powers, such as, in fact, Milan, Florence, Pisa, etc. But needless to say, this mercenary phenomenon was, let's say, easier to spread in central Italy, exactly because of this lack, say, this lower statal standards. So, in other words, it was more fragmented. It was also a fairly rich place to loot. And so there, it was more complicated to stamp them. But don't think that there was any broader capacity even there to seize any power. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't. Some condottieri did on the long run, but there is not like a broader settlement of a larger company that manages to become part of the political landscape or colonizing. There is no kind of that, because you could not simply unhinge this thick net of communes that just were always kind of, in spite of these loots and the plague and all the broader crisis of the time, ever staying under. They always struck back, and that's extraordinary. In fact, also considering that in the last decades of the 14th century, there is this shift from what had been, in fact, normally entirely foreign military forces at the service of the communes to solely, or almost solely, Italian at that point. And in fact, the later condottieri you see are basically all Italian. So this is also another very interesting aspect. It's not just connected to some timing, such as the Treaty of Bretigny, when the White Company arrives from the veterans of the 100 Years' War from France, with John Oak, with these quite effective troops. In fact, were used by all these players, the Visconti, Florence, and etc. But it's an adjustment of that medieval civilization that had been crippled by the crisis, and that finds a new balance later on from the within, right? Finding the military resources from the same Italian dispossessed, because the refeudalization of the system had brought naturally to lots of people. Think about the same Sforza. Literally, these were peasants, right? They weren't in nobility, but they rose through the ranks, fighting, and they got also quite significant, in fact, in this case, the most powerful Italian state, Milan, in their as their possession. So that's quite relevant. The same problems existed in the Kingdom of Naples and beyond. That mercenary companies are making a mess in France, with in Germany, pretty much everywhere. And so there is a lot of internationalization of warfare. You see that by the 14th century, Western European warfare is practically homogeneous everywhere. Any kind of local, ethnic, native shade of warfare has practically disappeared, especially in this broader Western Central area. Now, sometimes when you study, in fact, the history of these companies, you realize that they were literally expelled that there is a case of the great company that in the 40s crossed, left Tuscany and passed, in fact, through central Italy, arrived in the Romagnol area, and then went back to the north. But you realize what was happening. For example, nobody really even cared to crush them, because they knew they would just loot the countryside for a while, but they had to pass by, because that was also, by the way, their only mean of supply. So, of course, there was a lot of guerrilla most of the time, but let's say a city like, I don't know, Orvieto or other smaller ones didn't need to, to face in open field an army that could crush their entire force and as such may seize the city when this army, even if we didn't have the logistical resources to besiege the same city. They would just pass. Yes, it was a sacrifice, it was a cost they had to pay, but this would be also what we exclude from this general foreign element is that Italians destroyed each other constantly, right? It was normal for every comitatus to be regularly devastated every once in a while by the usual neighbors, and there was an enormous lot of political fragmentation. We talked about the exiles in the communal system. Like this was definitely not a peaceful place, as Contamine said and other authors recognized. This was actually the area that during the 13th and 14th century had easily the highest level of belligerence in Europe, right? There are an appalling amount of resources spent for war. And I would like to point out that this is exactly the moment and the place in which humanism and the Renaissance emerges. So the civilizational use of successful warfare, right, is a hallmark in the superiority of Western civilization at so many levels. And you can simply see it. I made a video about the splendid, naturally, Italian art regarding the depiction of the condottiere. Think about the one of John Oakwood in Florence by Uccello. Think about the statue of Colleone. Like, we're talking about literally some of the finest technological feats. Like in that case, in Padua, you have literally the first statue from since antiquity that was cast finally with a horse with a hired hoof that stood on itself in its barycenter. And so it's war was fueling civilization, because this was a virtuous system of warfare after all. It could have surely been, all the resources that could have been employed differently, there's no doubt about that, but it's just to say that superior civilizations are able to fight and win wars, right? And when they're not, there is something wrong with them. Italian wars, of course, show later on how also the Italian system had problems, and quite deep ones. But by the 14th century, we're essentially looking at an extraordinary success, especially of the signories that transformed this, again, initial 30s de facto independent city-states, all warring against each other, in essentially a handful of significant regional blocks that, again, also have the manpower, essentially the largest kingdoms in Europe individually, which is objectively impressive. And regarding this, we're making the example of the company roaming around the countryside and eventually being expelled, literally coming back to Germany. Most of these people came back, like if they weren't killed in their lifetime of war, they came back in their original countries. Again, this is also very interesting because you realize there was probably a military service required, right, from within Italy for these foreign troops to serve in their armies and to be well paid, right? And naturally looting, because they were sent against local Italian enemies as well, which was quite remunerative. And the Visconti are a bit the masters of this, because they are the first country that fundamentally has to deal with the permanent presence of these mercenaries in their army. And the roots of this are to be traced slightly before this period, in the 20s of the 14th century, where the papal army was about to take over Lombardy, and just Milan fundamentally was resisting against it. It was properly a crusade. I made a video about this, the one on the papal intransigence. We talk about the Dulcinians, but also about the crusade against the Visconti, during which the papacy that was at that point already at Avignon and was relying fundamentally on just this enormous financial resources. They spent something like 1,200,000 florins just for the War of Lombardy, and I don't know if you have the palest idea of what that means. I think Lucca was ransomed at 60,000 florins. That is to say, a city costed that. Another medium-sized city costed that. The papal army spent 1,200,000 florins. The astronomical ciphers that were used by the papal states to essentially recruit, literally out of scratch, like out of any form of record of local regiment of territorial domination in Lombardy. They didn't have, naturally relying on the allies locally, but still literally coalescing an army from nowhere and sending it against Milan and settling in Monza, that is just next door, and threatening the city for years. And on that occasion, the Milanese and the Visconti, that were already lords of the city, that had relied more traditionally, like other cities in Italy, on the original, in fact, city force, right? The army, with they were mostly salaried troops in many ways, but they were locals, right? They were levied from practically all over Lombardy, because Milan already controlled the province as a whole, and it had gradually been absorbing all the surrounding cities. But that had not done up to that point actually a great use of mercenaries at all. The popes in this sense had been path openers in that direction. But what happened during the siege of Milan, the wars, these battles between Milan, Monza, and surroundings, is that the war had been effectively won because the Visconti had managed to buy out the decisive part of the papal German mercenaries that had passed from their side. And these men were very aware of their political and strategic weight, so much that they, while the war was still going on, at the point they attempted a coup in Milan, which is rare elsewhere, really. So the Visconti were the first ones they were obliged to use these troops, but they were beaten the earliest. And so actually the situation was resolved because these German mercenaries realized that in the papal army they would have not found much of a favored place back, because mostly at that point there was the cardinal legate and commander of the papal army, that was Bertrand de Pouget, who preferred his Provençal troops, and so they decided to stick with to the Visconti and to bring the lord their lord back in power. And from there on, like, eventually the Milanese win the war, thanks to these Germans that scored couple of decisive victories. The papal army is obliged to leave Monza and to retreat, and fundamentally the whole enterprise fails, right? Bertrand de Pouget remains around in places like Emilia, but also becomes Lord of Bologna before being expelled. Eventually the guy comes back to Provence and dies there peacefully. It was a rare thing, but after all, he was a cardinal. This after they had, the Pope had even allied itself with the German Emperor. I mean, this kind of messed up things that, again, if you don't study in depth the 14th century, you can't really, you don't hear around, but they're very, 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 very interesting times, especially during the pontificate of John the 22nd. And the aspect here that is important to highlight is that Milan, from that moment onwards, basically maintains non-stop this de facto permanent core of mercenaries. There are literally just knights. Like the sources in this are like we don't have so many documents, or we mostly rely on chronicles, right? You don't think that medieval history can be reconstructed from archive sources, because those are brutally limited, even in some of the most florid times of florid production like this one. And what we see, however, is that while that there is practically no infantry among these foreign mercenaries. This is very interesting. The German presence is explained through, for example, the crisis of the ministerialis class that had prospered during the 13th century, but with the interregnum and the affirmation of the German princely states kind of decay a bit and or become mercenaries, and or they find a better job in Italy, higher pay, especially in places like Milan. Again, it was disgustingly rich, to say the least, and other, like Florence, like Venice, that in fact do not lesinate at all to invest enormous sums to create this mercenary armies. The Florentines and the Venetians, for example, knocked out the Della Scala Signory. It also was competing with Milan for the hegemony over the Po Valley, and that, however, didn't have like a single true center like Milan that could really swallow all the others. It was mostly like this Veronese signory, but Verona was as much a much smaller city, so it was easier to make this super city domination crumble compared to the Visconti. But as we were saying also in those videos about the French military organization of the 15th century, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, etc., well, there the French sources are very eloquent. They say that this idea of maintaining what were de facto mercenaries independently from their nationality, whether it could be French, they could be German, they could be Italian, doesn't matter. The point here is, again, professionalism, that is to say, how much they remained in service every day. Well, the French had, the sources said that, the Commune, also that understood something about that, they had copied it from the Italians. They had copied it from especially Milan and other, well, at that point also Venice, that had actually the best conduct at the time, the best army after the Burgundian one, as at least an administrative model, and that had begun exactly around this point, right? Sometimes we indicate 1356, 1361, like the time, in fact, after the first, after Poitiers, right, where the French still maintain for, the winter season their troops at a point, because there is an emergential situation. Says historiography says that's the first time that there is the core of a permanent army. Actually, if you look at the Milanese, you realize that this began good decades earlier, and that there wasn't much like an imitational need to maintain these troops. Of course, this was a comparable European situation where you needed, for the political and social crisis of the time, etc., the state taking over and essentially paying these professionals with the money that were available and sheltering a bit more their productive background, the people, their work, the fields, and so on. So similar countries, similar things going on also from a military point of view. The reason why Milan was so powerful, as we were saying before, is that it had been essentially absorbing the surrounding cities starting from the 12th century, right? The first expedition of Frederick Barbarossa, aside from bringing back the Pope back, in fact, in Rome, because the Roman commune had expelled him, was to deal with the Milanese expansionism that the other Lombard cities didn't like at all, except eventually Barbarossa managed to inimicate the same people who had asked for his help, because took the chance to try to take over everything and centralizing and exacting till the last penny from these communes, and it objectively overlapped as a broader power now on the same Lombardy narrowly meant, right? Also other cities that are in the modern areas of Piedmont that at the time was considered as Lombardy, which means that the local communes effectively are not independent anymore. You see that in the early 14th century, literally the news of their expeditions decreased dramatically together with the size of the same contingents, and you realize in parallel the Milanese army increases, right, and intensifies as expeditions. So you realize that they overlap. Also because, of course, we know politically that the Visconti took over the single cities as lords, right? So again, in theory, the city kept working the same way, but what this factually meant is that the local communities are disarmed, and the money that is also saved from the lack of these expeditions is actually paid to Milan to hire the mercenaries. Except also there is a broader Milanese, especially banking penetration, because the Milanese bankers take over the assets of these communes. In fact, merchants, bankers, and consider that most of these communes were taken over by force, right? So you understand there that it was an extortion fundamentally, but that's also how civilization is made. Now, as a consequence, and also because they were becoming a threat more or less for anybody around, the Visconti engaged in an almost interminable series of wars, right? Made most of the resources, as we've seen, provided by the subject centers, both by raking in money, useful for paying the mercenaries, and by asking for significant contributions from infantry and knights. This latter aspect is fascinating because you realize that while the professional mounted heavy element was the core of the armies, of course cavalry was decisive. Italy doesn't have an infantry victory like other areas in Europe, like Flanders, Switzerland, Scotland, etc. The cavalry always maintains the upper hand, even in the moment of the strongest development of infantry, that in Italy were quite strong since the 12th century at the latest. But this mercenary cavalry rise corresponds also to the shrinking of the same infantry numerically, and also in the sources. In fact, you read that the chroniclers that at some point had been quite, some of which lived for a very long time, and so they commented on various events, also the past ones, before cared about infantry, said there are this given amount of cavalry, this given amount of infantry. Towards the beginning of this period, the mid-14th century, they just told cavalry, right? Because infantry was surely there, and we actually know it was there because we have some documents telling us that at this dispositionally, the citizenry and the peasantry had to be ready. They were also very well armed. Like the peasants had actually the full infantry panoply of the citizen forces, right? That could surely rely on better equipment in general because of their material wealth. But we're talking about a de facto semi-professional system, even for the militias. But these elements are secondary, right? They are very important for anything related to sieges, logistics, military engineering in general. There are specialized corps, probably pioneers of other technicians, etc. But and there is a support, especially of crossbowmen, pavismen. The pikemen too are there, but they tend to shrink dramatically in size. And thus you realize that also the contingents required to the various communes are, after all, relatively modest. There are just a few instances in which the community could be emergentially called to arms. There are instances in which the same Milan is threatened. For example, there is a Visconti feud in the 30s, for which an expelled Visconti hires the veterans of the Della Scala that had lost the aforementioned war against Venice and Florence, and the Veronese do not have any money. So the Visconti says, well, okay, I will take them, and we will march on Milan, Well, at that point at the Battle of Parabiago, he realized that the Milanese mobilized again their city forces, and they actually managed to defeat the enemy, this essentially German army. Except, also they had allies that were quite important from other areas of Savoy or other surrounding allies, because it was a bloodbath, and the same Milanese militia struggled to defeat the Germans, some of which were hired by Milan after they were captured. So that's how it normally worked, right? You realize how, in a sense, messed up it is. Why Germans? Well, it's a bit the aforementioned reason. The crisis of the Ministeriales, the fact that Germany had boomed demographically, had actually surpassed Italy by this point. But it had been struck more by the 14th century crisis because it was not as rich as Italy, and so all this German youth fundamentally pours into the richest place in Europe where they could find that kind of service, in fact. This happens also, again, as I was saying before, with other nationalities, right, from all over the surrounding countries. But that's mostly what the German preeminence is about. Then, there are the English, right, with a white company, but they are kind of more like kind of individual companies. Like what you see is mostly at the beginning of the 14th century, there's an enormous lot of German troops. Mostly, they began as veterans of the army of Henry of Luxembourg. They stayed there. They were hired by the peasants that scored this dramatic victory over the Florentines, and the pattern goes on. And then there is this generalization mostly of German and or French mercenaries that also basically bring to the disappearance of the Aragonese that after the Sicilian Vespers had somewhat figured in the form of the Almogalvares with this kind of mostly infantry and also bit of cavalry at the time, but that lighter type disappears completely, and that's also quite meaningful because of because it tells you that properly even the victors at Cephissus over the same French cavalry of the Athenians didn't have a room, right, in a cavalry-dominated world like Italy was. And hardly because the local infantry culture was not developed at all. As a matter of fact, actually the Italian infantries were even better than the lighter kind of Almogalvares type conceptually, also much more abundant. So that tells a lot. Like European warfare was becoming ever tougher, heavier, and expansive, and that's also why. Also, infantry still as a lighter arm, after all, especially in that massive amount, the squeezed the city and the countryside didn't quite fit the order of things, especially with the economic crisis, with Black Death. I mean, a mess really had happened. The Milanese, speaking again of the Visconti military system, employed their nobility from the same Milan and the surrounding territory in this expansionistic enterprise, right? The leaders of the army were Milanese. So this was crucial to maintain a grip on the same Milanese oligarchy that, as we've seen, mostly financed this expansion, providing most of the officers and the commanders of the army. The effectiveness of this system allowed the vast territorial conquests of the lords of Milan, and was demonstrated several times on the battlefield, right, on which the same Milanese forces, properly as city ones, either noblemen or militia, made significant contributions. We remembered Parabiago before, but for example, in Casarat Primo, in the autumn of 1356, the Visconti army inflicted a heavy defeat on the great company of the Count of Landau, forcing him to retire in disorder to Pavia. That was one of the few cities that were resisting to Milan in Lombardy. and ironically also one of the closest ones to Milan geographically. And on this occasion, according to the testimony of Petrus Azzari, that is a famous Lombard chronicler at the time, the Visconti, the heart of the victorious army was still made up of the urban troops of Milan and of other cities, in which still infantry played a significant role, and which, skillfully exploiting the terrain, managed to hit from the flanks the German cavalry, blocked on the roads, surrounded by moats and vineyards, right? So creating difficulty to thousands of heavy cavalry, right, on this quite, inhabited Lombard countryside, and thus contributing significantly to their annihilation. The Battle of Casarat is very interesting because consider that armies were becoming ever heavier too, and difficult to move and to manage. This is a bit of the alleged immobilism of the later condottieri warfare that is not really such. It's that these armies were, in terms of specific weight, extremely heavy, right? And so they required a massive logistical and thus statal administrative set of resources. And in this sense, Milan shows off because it demonstrates what we were saying before, that this political territorial dominations had an edge over the companies after all, because they had a greater local support. Now, a few years later, Bernabò Visconti attempted to create a native elite corps, enlisting a group of select young people from the Milanese domain. Between 1369 and 1370, in the various cities of Lombardy, some of the noblest and wealthiest citizens were called to arms to form a new mounted unit called the Provisionati, so the provisioned ones, whose number was about 1,000 men. The Provisionati is a term that eventually extends. You've probably heard it if you're into Italian Renaissance warfare, these kind of things, to the general salaried troops of the Italian signories. And so in this case, and most of the times they were lighter troops, like mostly infantry, and they were not much more than pioneers, fundamentally. Because at the time also the cavalry had become ever heavier, and mercenaries had an increasingly specialized role, and there were gunners, there were artillery, and so on. At this point, the provisionati literally means that we're given a provision, we're salaried in a way. And so in this case, we're talking about a core group of heavy cavalry. As you realize, these were noblemen, so there were also people normally trained in arms, in cavalry. We know that Italy at this point had a pretty kind of advanced chivalric also tournament, tradition in generally speaking. The gentlemen cared very much about their military education, and this is witnessed also interestingly by foreign observers and so on. And thus you have, like in many other armies, like you have the elite of your dominion that is tested also in fidelity on the battlefield, that competes with one another within the lord's retinue in this regard. That's what they are, as an elite corps. A privileged group formed around the lord, personally linked to him and attracted to the service, and not so much by the promised 8 florins of monthly salary, that also for a nobleman it was not even this enormous thing, but consistent, we're talking about 200 florins a month. It's not irrelevant, right? But the most important thing is, which is much more valuable than that economically, is the prestige that the role of the prince's personal escort provided, right? Political opportunities, such as marriages into the seigneurial family. In fact, the seigneury of over some communes, and all the profits that were derived from that, and also some like the military glory and loot and so on. These were the finest troops, so there was also relatively less mortality, or at least they tended to profit more from war in general. Consider this man had home some private clienteles, and they could mobilize troops. They had grip on the local communes that surely their families controlled, and at least also castles and more. So this was some kind of extra, especially for the younger elements, as you understand. They were the science that were making military practice and of the probably the heavier type of warfare. So these temporary professionals, let's call them in this way, received a special uniform with a jacket, hood, and cloak in red cloth and metal strips, which emphasized their peculiarity and their position as favorites. And they were used in the field also with a certain intensity, especially in the troubled 70s of the century. They were naturally playing a very, shrewd political game with all the various factions struggling against one another. Were constantly involved in this political and military game. There was no rest in this world in the first place. And albeit they wouldn't become an alternative to the use of companies that were still the dominant element, they were the bulk of the Milanese forces. This was just the cream, an elite, something that again had also this political purpose. They undoubtedly represented still a precise signal of the Visconti desire to maintain strict control over the military apparatus of their dominion. After all, they had succeeded with the mercenaries. There weren't coups anymore. They always could keep them well under check. So this is actually a very big political success, which proved in general just the need of the same mercenaries of a stable Milanese dominion, right, to receive their pay and so on. And naturally, if Milan had been falling apart, yes, they would have liked to take over all the various cities and so on. But again, the presence of the strong political center prevented that from happening, right? These provisions certainly did not replace, as we just said, the use of mercenary troops. Indeed, the Visconti were the largest employers and the best payers in Italy, but they allowed them to be monitored and limited their arrogance. In general, the lords of Milan were able to safeguard the heart of their territory from the passage of companies as well, instead throwing them against their enemies in Piedmont, in Veneto, in Romagna, in Tuscany. If you think about this, also from the same reasons that had brought Milan to preeminence, the control of the Alpine passes, this rich, fertile western Po Valley area, the crossroads of with Mediterranean, with Central Europe, with France, with also as a broader passage to the lands of the empire. It was a great organizational center. It was full of resources. So obviously those who crossed the Alps from the north would immediately be sucked into the system in a way or another. So also from a political and strategical point of view, and a logistical one, the control of the Po River, of the affluents of the various cities over the rivers in Lombardy were also quite impressive strategic assets, with the fortified rings and all the bridges, etc., that connected also through the passes with the softer Tuscany, were obviously like the place of gathering, right? The area of gathering of most of these foreign mercenaries, right? They knew there was this magnificent lord who would pay them, and they could be thrown towards, in fact, the periphery that was often unstable. The Visconti had troubles, as we were saying before. They had dynastic struggles within each other, so what happened is that they could even extend the control at some point, large parts of Tuscany, of Liguria, of the Romagnol area, etc. But again, these were they had a seigneury over cities, and actually some frontier cities were even more eager to give their seigneury to the Visconti, because they knew that in any case Milan was too far to exert too much of an oppressive rule. But as soon as a crisis in Milan occurred, of course, this periphery would shrink dramatically, and so most of the Milanese heartland was Lombardy, as we were saying before, and so still from there, this hungry wolves could be sent against the periphery, where also cities often became the target, right? Because being their less powerful city powers in the first place, also the feudal element, very often the Apenninic one, this kind of, in fact, more lineage based, and also, in fact, more shrewdly opposed to the cities, waiting to erode their local seigneuries that still existed to become the lords of the same cities, were often used by the same Visconti in the frontier areas. For example, the ones between them and the Este, right, in Emilia. And in part, the same Veneto seigneuries in their decline had a similar function. As you understand, and as we were saying before, the cost of such large amount of mercenaries was shared among the subject communities, who could deduct it simply from the salarium domini, that is to say, the monthly tax that the communes dependent on the Visconti had to pay them. Everything was simplified from an administrative point of view. The Milanese also carried out a broader uniformation of administrative practices, in spite of course, the differences that existed from commune to commune. This is, Lombardy has, in this sense, a more unitary outlook than, say, Tuscany, where administration was largely decentralized in a heterogeneous way. But let's say sometimes the dissenters could decide whether to send their own men or participate in the payment of soldiers of fortune. Other times, instead, the provisions of the lords were more precise, ordering to pay sums to this or that captain. And the captains were just the company's leaders. Companies had originally been a few size, right? They had emerged from literally the same individual lanxes in high medieval times, so the single knights, and eventually gathering many others along the way, and there were companies even of thousands of men later on that could be eventually enfeoffed by, their employers, such as it happened with the aforementioned Corleone, the Venetians, and so on. But there were many of them, so any good captain, constable could show off, right, and making some sort of greater of career, because naturally the better he was and the more paid he would be, and so the more companies would join him, right? And so everything would essentially follow that pattern. All the most important 14th century units, from the great company of the Earl of Landau to the White Company of John Oakwood, passed into the Visconti service, but usually remained there for quite short periods. Rather, the lords of Milan preferred to enlist smaller units, also to render them less dangerous, as you understand, or even sometimes individual warriors who were easier to control. Thus, for example, in 1370, the Lord of Milan, Galeazzo II, led to his orders 26 German, Flemish, and Hungarian knights, all individually listed, specifying that each one must have for his personal lanks, quote, so 3 good enough horses, so we're talking about ultra heavy cavalry, and being armed from head to toe, and having another knight armed with belly, helmet, knee pads as required, and sword and knife, and also a boy, so an attendant. And the aforementioned named above, each of them individually taken, are to serve with the said weapons and horses and aids foretold, as for the magnificent Signor Galeazzo, Count of Virtu, for all the time in which the magnificent Prince of Cotton, this was a German mercenary, will serve at the salaries of the said magnificent Messer Galeazzo, or Signor Galeazzo, with the pact that they will receive 30 gold florins per lance and squire, or only 20 per lance, each month in which they will be in service. The said soldiers and squires will have 2 months' salary in advance as a loan, for a total of 1,100 florins. And this hiring contract is very interesting, highlighting a feature that we were highlighting before regarding the ethnicity of these troops. You see, they're German, Flemish, Hungarian, etc. But also, because you realize that some of these mercenaries and their companies were, of course, noblemen from other countries. This is quite frequent in Italy since kind of ever. I mean, knights had always been noblemen of some sort, right? But sometimes, this is documented for Florence, for other powers, the communes ambassadors would go to France, to Germany, etc., and they would literally hire by themselves individually, so without any, king or other local prince brokering the thing. Their enlistment, right? And normally, as a knight, you could do that. Like, you had some feudal duties to perform to your king, but if you wanted to serve abroad, you would go. And as we were noticing also in the recent video made on medieval French nobility, actually last summer, and in other videos we made also German mercenarism, etc., you realize that there was a stratification of the nobility occurring at this point, where the poorest knights, the poorest nobility, just preferred to go at war, roaming, like as an errant or knight. I mean, even the same, think about the King of Bohemia, John of Luxembourg. This guy fought everywhere, right? He died at Crusade, but he had been fighting in the Baltic, in Italy, in Germany, in France. So there is some sort of fairy tale flavor also sometimes from these biographies, because they are really the brutally romantic Middle Ages that sometimes we said, well, this thing was not true. They did that, of course, for non-romantic reasons, but still because they felt it was somewhat a duty of a nobleman just to live like that and to profit in the process. There is another term that's very important to remember: the Bandarium, the Banneria, the Bandari, whatever you want to call it. That naturally stands for banner. That is something a bit larger than the company insignia, and that therefore includes several of them, and the larger contingents here, sometimes hundreds of knights individually. That, in fact, in the second half of the 14th century becomes somewhat generalized. The knights enlisted in this way were properly organized into bandaries, even though maybe they were also kind of regionally independent fortune seekers, like that would be grouped with the others. Each banderia was headed by a constable who could be Italian or foreigner. The bandaries, grouped into larger units, were headed by the so-called collaterals, we can say, usually members of the nobility of Milan and the territory, who in turn responded directly to the lord. So the political connection is quite evident with the head of the bandaries, the largest units. At least from 1348, the date of its first certification, a special bank of salaries people was created, like with responsibility of finding the resources to pay the hired soldiers. Needless to say, as was exemplifying before, the cost of these troops was enormous. I don't know if you realize, as we were saying before, what it means to have 5,000 to 6,000 barbuta at your service. It literally means you have 6,000 knights, right? The sources are interesting in this regard because even though, in the Middle Ages there was some sort of tactical segmentation, right? And also the condottieri armies will, towards late Middle Ages, will evolve in the general pattern, tactical specialty, because, it was this ultra heavy core of heavy, in fact, of cavalry, and then other troops that had to simply pave their way, because otherwise it would have been too cumbersome and unwieldy. When you read this sources from the 14th century, you realize that when it says, in fact, I don't know, that this army was made up of 4,000 barbuta. Let's make the case. You realize that no other forts seem to be listed with them. As we were saying before, there is, for example, hardly any infantry remembered, even though there surely was, and cavalry doesn't travel faster than infantry in a strategical sense. You still have all the wagons, the carriages, and so on. So, and there is not even properly a diversification of the tactical employment. We know there were kind of light cavalry here and there, but they're very rare, just rarely described in action in general. So you realize that these were actually heavy cavalry altogether of some sort. Of course, there was a minimal segmentation, stratification between them and different panels, but mostly were all actual knights, right? So the cost of this, again, each of these guys have 3 horses. That means you have armies followed by tens of thousands of horses. The sheer logistical impact is enormous, right? It is true that this Italian city-states could supply, again, from the same cities that were all well, served, infrastructures well connected through the river. The rivers of Lombardy, for example, were all very thick and so on. The powers were very rich. They could import resources, whatever. But we're talking about a massive amount of troops. Again, just the largest French armies have such an amount of soldiers. These powers use them habitually. And Italy is somewhat smaller, especially it had, just like today, the highest demographic concentration in Europe per territory. And the majority, in fact, of the people are concentrated in places like at the time, Lombardy, Tuscany, the Apennine areas that are normally almost inhabited. So you realize that there was a massive effort and support from the whole system concentrated for the success of these expeditions. And that's why it was also so hard to make any breakthrough at the end of the day. Of course, a force of this might could easily overrun many places, but again, even just committing yourself in the Middle Ages against a fortified city, as the chance that existed in Pobal, the question is, you just have to bog down yourself, because again, you have thousands of heavy cavalry. I don't know if you have an idea of the hygienic problems posed by the concentration of even just the amount of horses there. It's an enormous logistical cost. You have to bring supplies from everywhere. It's enormous, right? So this explains a lot also the aforementioned issue of the condottieri and what was in this relatively narrow space, the capacity of deploying such huge amount of military force. The banks, there was all an administrative system that had to work together with the signory to finance these troops and to have just capitals readily available. And again, that was, generally speaking, they were a good investment after all, because it was the same polity you were in that you had to invest in, right? People understood it very clearly at the time. Today, it seems that people don't understand that if you want to rule the world, you have to fight wars and pay taxes. Well, these people understood it. So never think you're more intelligent than a person that lived 700 years ago, because you're not. Right? The average person today is, in relative terms, consistently more stupid for the world they live in than people who lived 700 years ago. There's no doubt about this on any educational, intellectual, and moral level, and scientific one as well, of course. And these banks had, first of all, a central office and then peripheral branches in the various cities of the Milanese domain, and to control which the companies were subjected by the stately officers, also by means of the drawing up of detailed lists, the attention to expenses divided between the subject communities and the stately chamber. As we've seen, France is carrying out similar reforms because of the needs posed by the 100 Years' War, and this similar, again, comparable amount of troops deployed. In this Milanese case, there is the creation of the purpose of specific magistracies, even emerging evidently in letters, such as, for example, this one written in December 1363 by Bernabò Visconti to his collaborator Guido da Vimercate. It says, quote, "We have received your letters about how you found our people," the soldiers, "both the old and those of the brigade of Annechino." This is Anneken Bongarten. This was a German constable present in the district of Brescia. This is a Lombard city east of Milan, which indeed have observed the deputies to the salaries of the commune of Brescia are in excess of the number of 600 barbute, another 112 barbute, counting all the men described in the notebook you sent us. We are glad that you charge all 712 barbute from our chamber and enlist them all on our salaries. These sources are extraordinary. Just with the late Middle Ages, you start finding them. In any case, starting from, say, 1378, Gian Galeazzo Visconti created a stable relationship with one of the best military commanders of the time, Jacopo dal Verme, from Verona, making him the general captain of the entire Visconti army. Dal Verme von Mallet, the great historian of the Italian Renaissance warfare, defines as, quote, "a serious professional, alien to risky acts," and of course, because the stakes were dramatically high, managed to beat some of the most renowned opponents, including John Oakwood, by the way, and remained in the service of Gian Galeazzo until his death in 1402. These forces, of course, were capable of coping, as we were saying before, and you realize, as we were saying before, in the last decades of the 14th century, these start to be Italians specifically, and getting rid fundamentally also of the foreign presence. And so this age of the soldiers of fortune in Italy, at least, of this foreign companies, and the mention of the defeat of John Oakwood is interesting because Lombardy at this point was also producing longbows for exportation to England, right? And a few people know this, but the pre-alpine areas of Lombardy have very specific weather that confers the woods there the right characteristics of elasticity for the longbow, right? And were produced in Italy and exported in England. And interestingly enough, even though you have English troops like the ones of the White Company, etc., fighting in Italy and also scoring successes, right? This just, everybody loses and wins at some point, were not used locally. So the Italians knew the longbow. They knew what it was about since ever, basically, because it was full of merchants everywhere. Castracani was a favorite of Edward the First in London. There were, everybody kind of knew what was going on in both places. That they wouldn't use the longbow. They would rely, as most Europeans, on crossbow, right? At this point, and this is fascinating. Because aside from the fact that Milan had and Lombardy had the best arms and armory production in Europe, literally on an industrial scale, like in the same level of professional organization that you find from Viscondotte and exporting all over, but you have properly a an awareness of not just the rest of European warfare, but also, possibility of saying, okay, these guys need these weapons, we will send them, but here we don't use them. Because even if we have the most updated military around, still in our system, these ones do not work, or at least are not needed specifically, and so we can do without them. This is a very interesting concept which has been emerging, in fact, in Anglo-Saxon historiography, because it says, but what about these longbows? What was the deal? I explained it many times, and of course the systems were comparable, right? There is hardly any, collective superiority of either the longbow or the crossbow on each other, right? If one understands military technology like that, probably cannot understand history in general, warfare, right? It's a mirage, it's an illusion, right? And we will keep talking about these things. There are also other excellent names in Visconti service. For example, Alberico da Barbiano, enlisted in 1392 with a 10-year contract and remaining employed by the Visconti for a long time. And Milan was in wide advance of the other Italian powers in understanding the opportunity to create stable relationships of collaboration and loyalty with native constables, with Italians, bound for long periods. Right? This would ensure somewhat the greater political and social integration of their military forces in the domains, right? Before, you easily understand it was a market issue, right? That were lots of foreign troops on the market at fair price, and so they would rather buy them. But on the long run, right, also to, of course, prevent the broader disciplinary problems. Today we didn't talk about that. They existed, and they were, however, generally repressed and successfully, also brutal means. The importance of creating properly a native national force was kind of emerging more potent. And even in Veneto, so in this northeastern Italian province, the transition from the communal army to the mercenary condotte took a long time to be complete. It was a very gradual system. And as you understand, mercenaries had also kind of always existed. It's just that with the collapse of the communal army, because of the loss of independence of the various communes to this greater seigneuries, they were still commune-based, they were still city-based, but just one over this many others. The idea, as we've seen, was disarming these subjects and just having a more centralized system of recruitment. Before, the city relied just on herself, so it was obvious just to have a communal army, an exercitus of the local citizenry and the peasants of the district. Now, instead, you need more, and also more professional force, because you understand the distances were also greater, and so the time of service was required for a longer time and longer distances. Sometimes could be literally hundreds of kilometers. When you talk about the permeability of certain areas of Italy, it literally means that there could be wide raids carried out at several hundreds of kilometers of distance. It was a lot of back and forth in the first place, from places like Rome, Naples, Florence, Milan, and more, right? So all across the peninsula. Although many testimonies show that the citizens served more and more reluctantly, and also because they were invested in those more industrial activities of textile production, broader, in fact, even the same arms and armor production, it needed this massive circuit, right, to work, right? So this is also a reason why there is a lack of broader political unification in Italy before the Italian wars, because these states, as rich as they were also, in fact, individually small, right? So the people who inhabited there were not in the millions, and Italy had the highest per capita wealth in the world at the time. So it's obvious that the person who can avoid to go out to war because it's just invest in a broader system and can pay others will use mercenaries and not create, for example, a broader national force like the Swiss did. They were still kind of half mountaineers and half commoners, right? In a different war, but altogether they were that more united mass. Here the problem was different because you have just the need of essentially also limiting, paradoxically, the military activity to preserve this productive wants instead. However, and not to be too mechanistic and structuralistic, the urban infantry still retained a significant importance, right? It's, again, not much of a protagonist, but say, although the general mobilizations of the entire exercitus became rarefied, the deployment of strong local contingents composed of several thousand men does remain a common practice throughout the century. Right? It's rare to find, for example, like contingents that are made up of more cavalry than infantry. Right? You can have, again, some detachments, some contingents sent ad hoc for some missions, but tactically speaking, infantry was needed pretty much in every operation. And of course, if it had to be significant, given it was not a decisive arm, it had to be numerically superior to cavalry to be of any use. Naturally, this same communal troops were joined by increasing number of mercenaries. As we were saying before, these foreigners were hardly infantrymen themselves, especially in the first half of the 14th century. You see a very rare mention of any form of infantry, mostly just crossbowmen, by the way. So troops also that would fight in open order and just assist cavalry in this more flexible tactical deployment, as opposed to the bulky Italian infantries that had up to that point represented a formidable force, but still were very costly for the communities, and that were still made up mostly of pikemen, and yes, also crossbow, etc. But with the reduction of the first specialty inferior, in fact, this more flexibly deployable one. During the 14th century, with the establishment of these seigneurial states, the resource of the exiles also ceased as it had been peculiar of the communal warfare at the time. The city-states, as long as they remained divided, could expel enemies, but these enemies would be always welcomed by the neighboring cities, and they would carry out guerrilla and raids, etc. in the original countryside to weaken the commune. And that's also how the same seigneurial states had formed, because the more powerful cities had been able to bully and subject the other ones more easily. But as a consequence, when the city fell under somebody else's domination, it was de facto political compaction under it. Right, as we were saying before, for the Visconti, is very evident in Lombardy. In some frontier areas, you have important factions that always support this and this. Anyway, but in the core lands, this does exist. There is always a political mechanism within for which factions fight against one another, and they are connected, of course, with the external. But they become less meaningful. Right? Also because this core land accepts fundamentally the stability and the privilege properly brought by osmosis, just in wealth, by the center towards this closer periphery. And this is also part of the reason why, for example, so many foreign, mostly German mercenaries arrive, because when you're not involved, the exiles had been very often also noblemen, right? Important people with their retinues and so on. So those were Italian, and it's rare to find much of mercenarism next to them. At best, you find even a power like Milan hosting exiles and fighting with foreign mercenaries, but rarely you find, let's say, somebody who was mostly entrenched in the countryside, in the mountains, from their castles, and having enough force to structurally field mercenaries. Also, they would just be very morally loaded in that condition of inferiority on their own to afford that. This is relevant because the first significant employment of foreign mercenaries in around late communal times is actually witnessed in small cities, smaller cities at least. Perugia is not that small, but let's say just by Central Italian standards, it's not just like say Papal State standard, not just Florence, for example, or Milan. But as few as they could be, you realize that the Umbrian city-states made use of foreign mercenaries relatively early on. And again, because in the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, normally the Neapolitans, the French, helped the former, and the Germans helped the latter. So it was normal to have foreign troops, foreign commanders, also in the times of the full Italian communal army took the field. Think about the Battle of Campaldino with Amaury de Narbonne. From randomly passing by Florence, they asked that he was going to Naples because of the Angevin point. Said, you want to be our leader? Yeah, because these were knights in a broader feudal sense, and they were connected politically. And from the other side, the Ghibellines had few mercenaries because they were in areas of more traditionalist or so more feudal in nature, but they bore the arms of Rudolf of Habsburg, just like a broader reference. So of course the international, and not only that, but when Rudolf of Habsburg actually sends, I think to the same Arezzo, some French-speaking mercenaries, the Aretines do not like them and send them away, because even though they were paid by the king of the Romans, this sounded French, and that for a Ghibelline that was not good, right? They wanted the German ones. Whereas we're talking about the end of the 13th century, by the beginning of the 14th century, even the most hardcore Guelph powers start hiring Germans and also distancing themselves from Naples, because also some of the commanders that the Angevins had sent from those were the French royals. They committed some disasters, such as at Montecatini, against the German knights of the peasants. So that it's that interesting in perspective. And so this company simply, as we've seen, increased in size over time. They were called banneries and so on, and so at first enlisted in single contingents, they organized themselves into even larger companies. And this is pretty evident in this phase of statal consolidation, the passage from foreigners to Italians. And from the 40s of the 15th century is especially very evident. But speaking of Veneto again, like the Visconti, the La Scala and the Carrara managed to practically never lose control of their troops. Right? Sometimes, telling the truth, it happens, but not in a disastrous sense. Very often the communal communities were sufficient, as we were saying before, within the city gates to freeze the situation. There are interesting massacres of these knights in the city streets, even in relatively small centers like in Pistoia. So the Germans are massacred at some point. In Padua, at some point the Germans were surrounded, and the Lord had to enter the city because the population would have probably chopped them down. And naturally, there is an effort, as we've seen, to create a real chain of command that could prove to be quite efficient. We have the Rossi from Parma, for example, that in Venetian service are quite repressive towards abuses, violences. They simply hang the responsible. They don't give a damn about it. Brutally efficient, also from a disciplinary point of view. So already at the twilight of the Commune, the role of the podestas, guide of the troops, was declining in favor of the captain, connected with properly a lord. Like, this is the point. The podesta is often evolving in a lord himself, in a way, or at least the title is attributed to people that are factually lords, also have an important connection locally, and or they get the same rights the podestas get. The podesta had been called institutionally in the Italian communes to just be a super partes, mostly military commander that had to obey the political direction of the commune and respect the statutes and so on. But the lord takes over. Like, the podesta was called, again, by all the parts to avoid further bloodshed, to maintain a strong, in theory, neutral force over them. The system doesn't hold, right? And so it's a local faction that sees, in fact, a main figure taking over privately, and so surpassing even the podestas as factual lord. This is the case for Milan. This is the case the Visconti, the della Scala in Verona. In Verona, over time, a very distinct group of public officers with exclusive military duties was differentiated, like with a system that was eventually systematized by the Visconti between 1387 and 1403, and also by the Venetians in the 15th century. So they were headed by the lords who often personally attended the battlefield and directly directed the clashes, right? Of course, there was no lack of conflicts of authority with foreign commanders who did not digest to be to submit to their local counterparts, but on the whole, the Veneto was the object of raids or blackmail by the large foreign companies with much less frequency than central Italy, for example. So you realize that the system still somewhat held, right? Consider that northeastern Italy is closer to the German areas in a broader cultural sense, and the counts of Gorizia, for example, backed by the Habsburgs, and hiring troops from Slavic and Hungarian lands, very often entering the Venetian plain, were quite quite offensive, quite dangerous. But these signories somewhat managed to counter it, and eventually just Venice would take over, so the things would there would be an end to that, to tell the truth. But still the local authority prevails. This is the core point that we've seen also in that video about medieval free rule. So, as I understand, there is a lot to dig into the systems. This is just a pretty sketchy presentation of what we're talking about, but it's full of actual campaigns and battles to study in detail, and also the broader political connections are crucial in the broader landscape. So we'll hopefully talk about these things. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.